The emergency lights flashed red across the massive space station New Harmony. In the central meeting hall, 12 different alien species sat around a curved table that could hold thousands. But today, only their most important leaders were present. And every single one of them looked terrified. Ambassador Veltar of the Zephyrians kept his wing-like appendages folded tight against his blue body. His people were known across the galaxy for their calm nature and wise decisions. Now his voice shook as he spoke into the translation device. 3 more star systems have gone dark, he said. That makes 15 in total. 15 entire worlds, with billions of lives just gone. The crystalline being called Quartzinger made a sound like breaking glass. The Archeons communicated through vibrations in their mineral bodies, and right now those vibrations carried pure fear. The survivors all tell the same story. Quartzinger's translated voice echoed in the chamber. They speak of the Devourers, creatures that bring such terror that whole populations cannot move, cannot think, cannot even scream. Round the table, other species nodded with their various heads, tentacles, and sensory organs. The 6-armed Canthari delegation huddled together. The floating gaspings of the ethereal collective dimmed their natural glow to almost nothing. Even the mighty Dorvac, whose warrior culture had conquered half their home galaxy, sat in silence with their massive forms trembling. High Admiral Zexinen of the Unified Defense Corps stood at the head of the table. His people, the hegemony, had been the first to achieve faster-than-light travel and had led the galaxy in peace for over 2,000 years. He was considered one of the greatest military minds alive. But even he seemed lost. Every world they attack follows the same pattern, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. First, the population reports feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Then they lose the ability to think clearly. Within hours, most inhabitants become so terrified they cannot leave their homes. The few who try to fight or flee describe feeling like their minds are being crushed by invisible weight. What about the defense fleets? Asked Commander Visas. Of the Aquatic Alliance, where people lived in the deep oceans of their water world and were known for their courage in the darkest depths. Gone, Zexinen replied. The crews report the same symptoms. Fear so intense that they cannot operate their ships. Those who don't evacuate immediately are found days later in catatonic states if they're found at all. The room fell silent except for the various breathing, humming, and clicking sounds that different species made when they were afraid. It was then that the communication panel at the center of the table began to flash. The voice that came through was different from all the others they had heard. It was steady, calm, and spoke in the common galactic language with an accent none of them recognized. New Harmony Station. This is Commander Jake Morrison of the human vessel U.S. Freedom. We received your distress call and are requesting permission to dock. Every alien in the room turned to look at each other. Humans, the newest species to join the galactic community. Barely 100 years since they had achieved faster-than-light travel. Most of the older civilizations considered them primitive, violent, and unpredictable. Humans, Veltar whispered. What could they possibly do against a threat that has defeated our greatest fleets? Admiral Zexinen activated the communication system. Commander Morrison, this is Admiral Zexinen. We appreciate your concern, but this situation is beyond dangerous. The enemy we face induces terror that can drive entire populations to madness. We strongly advise you to return to your home space. There was a brief pause before Morrison's voice returned. Understood, Admiral, but we're already here, and we'd like to help. Permission to come aboard. 20 minutes later, Commander Jake Morrison walked into the council chamber. He was tall by human standards, with dark hair and calm brown eyes. He wore a simple blue uniform that looked almost primitive compared to the advanced materials and energy-based clothing of the other species. Behind him walked 3 other humans. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, communications officer with short black hair, carried a data pad that seemed ancient compared to the holographic displays the aliens used. Chief Engineer Pete Collins, a stocky man with graying hair, looked around the chamber with open curiosity rather than the fear or awe most species showed when meeting the Galactic Council for the first time. Dr. Lisa Chen, their xenobiologist, had already begun taking readings with a handheld scanner. "Thank you for allowing us to dock," Morrison said, giving a slight bow that looked awkward compared to the complex greeting rituals other species performed. "We've been monitoring the situation from the Outer Rim territories. We'd like to offer our assistance." The aliens exchanged glances that would have been meaningless to humans, but conveyed volumes of information between species that had worked together for millennia. Finally, Veltar spoke. "Commander Morrison, I mean no disrespect to your species, but you do not understand what we face. The Devourers bring with them a psychic presence that causes paralyzing terror. The most advanced military minds in the galaxy have been reduced to helpless panic in their presence. Entire fleets have been found drifting in space, their crews unable to function." Morrison nodded as if this was useful information rather than a warning to flee. "We've read the reports. Dr. Chen here has been analyzing the data you've made available. The pattern is consistent across all affected species." Dr. Chen stepped forward, consulting her primitive datapad. "Every species that has encountered the Devourers has the same response pattern: immediate overwhelming fear, followed by paralysis, followed by either evacuation or catatonic breakdown. But there's something interesting in the biological data." She looked around the room at the assembled aliens. "Every species that has been affected evolved on what humans would call garden worlds: stable climates, predictable weather patterns, minimal natural disasters. Worlds where the greatest dangers came from other intelligent species, not from the environment itself," Course said Quartz Singer, his crystalline form flickering with confusion. "Civilized worlds provide stable conditions for proper development. Why would any species choose to remain on a dangerous planet?" The four humans looked at each other, and Morrison almost smiled. "Because we didn't have a choice. Earth isn't exactly what you'd call stable. We have earthquakes that can level cities, storms that can destroy entire regions, predators that have been trying to eat us since we climbed down from the trees, diseases that can wipe out half a continent, and weather patterns that change without warning." Chief Collins spoke up for the first time. "Where I grew up in Oklahoma, we had tornado drills in school twice a week, not because tornadoes were rare, but because they were so common we needed to practice surviving them." "This is disturbing," said Veltar. "Your species developed civilization despite living under constant threat?" "Not despite it," Lieutenant Rodriguez said. "Because of it. When you grow up expecting disaster, you learn to think fast and keep moving when things go wrong. When you know that predators might attack at any moment, you learn to watch for danger while still getting work done." Admiral Zexanon leaned forward in his chair. "You're suggesting that your harsh developmental environment might provide some resistance to the Devourer's fear effects?" Morrison shrugged. "There's only one way to find out. We're volunteering to investigate the dead zones. Our ship is small and fast. If we encounter the Devourers, we'll either confirm that they affect all species the same way, or we'll gather intelligence that might help develop a defense." The chamber erupted in sounds of alarm from multiple species. Veltar's wings fluttered. "Rapidly, Commander? That would be suicide. No ship that has encountered the Devourers directly has survived with a functional crew." "Then maybe it's time someone survived," Morrison said simply. "We've already loaded supplies for a long-range reconnaissance mission. With your permission, we'd like to start with the Kepler 442 system. According to your reports, it went dark 8 months ago, so any immediate danger should have moved on." The aliens looked at each other again, this time with something that might have been hope mixed with their fear. Finally, Admiral Zexanon spoke. "I cannot order you to undertake such a mission, Commander Morrison, but if you are determined to proceed, the Galactic Council will provide you with all available data and support." Morrison nodded. "Thank you, Admiral. We'll depart within the hour." As the humans prepared to leave, Dr. Chen paused at the door. "One more thing. You might want to start analyzing the psychological profiles of species that have been affected. We have a theory about why the Devourer's fear tactics work so well on civilized species." "And what theory is that?" asked Kortzinger. Chen looked back at the assembled representatives of 12 advanced civilizations, all of whom were still visibly terrified by an enemy they had never actually seen. Fear is supposed to help you survive, but if you've never had to use it that way, it becomes your enemy instead of your tool. An hour later, the U.S. Freedom undocked from New Harmony and jumped toward the dead Kepler system, carrying for humans. Toward an enemy that had paralyzed the galaxy with terror. The U.S. Freedom dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kepler 442 system. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge, looking at the main viewing screen. What he saw made his jaw tighten with anger. The star burned as bright as ever, a yellow sun, similar to Earth's own, but the 3 planets that had once supported 2 billion Valaxian colonists now looked like dead rocks floating in empty space. The orbital stations were still there, their metal hulls gleaming in the starlight, but something was wrong with them. "Life signs?" Morrison asked. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez checked her instruments. Nothing from the planets themselves. "But I'm picking up faint readings from the orbital stations and some underground locations on the second planet." Chief Engineer Pete Collins studied the energy readings from his position at the engineering station. The stations still have power, but their hulls show some kind of scoring patterns. It's almost like burn marks, but they're not from any weapon I recognize. Dr. Lisa Chen moved closer to the screen, her scanner beeping steadily. "Commander, those scoring patterns on the station hulls, they seem to be moving." Morrison looked more carefully. She was right. The dark marks on the metal surfaces seemed to shift and flow when he watched them directly, like living shadows crawling across the steel. "Could be some kind of optical illusion," Collins suggested, but his voice didn't sound convinced. "Or it could be exactly what it looks like," Morrison replied. "Take us in closer to the second planet." Slowly, Freedom moved through the dead system like a ghost ship visiting a graveyard. As they got closer to Kepler 442b, more details became visible. The planet had once been covered with cities that sparkled like jewels across the continents. Now those cities looked different. "God," whispered Rodriguez. "Look at the surface formations. The cities weren't destroyed. They were organized. Buildings had been sorted by size and placed in neat rows. Organic materials were separated from metal and stone. Everything was arranged with mathematical precision, as if some vast intelligence had been cataloging the entire planet before deciding what to take and what to leave behind." "It's like someone was doing inventory," Collins said, his voice tight with disgust. "They organized everything before they started eating it." Chief Medical Officer Dr. Sam Turner appeared on the bridge, carrying his medical scanner. "I've been monitoring the crew's vital signs since we entered the system. Stress hormones are elevated, which is normal given what we're seeing, but no signs of the psychological breakdown described in other encounters." Morrison nodded. "Any theories why we're not affected the same way as other species?" "Several, but I'd need more data to be sure. The important thing is that we can function normally in this environment when other species can't." Rodriguez's communication board suddenly came alive with incoming signals. "Commander, I'm picking up transmissions from the planet's surface. Multiple sources, all very faint. Can you clean them up?" She worked at her controls for several minutes before sounds filled the bridge. Voices speaking in the musical language of the Valaxians. But the tone was unmistakable. Fear, desperation, and underneath it all, a constant whispering that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Translation coming through now," Rodriguez said. Adjusting her equipment, the voices became clearer. "Day 243 in the deep shelters." The whispers continue. "Jexai reports that Section 7 has stopped responding to communications. We dare not investigate. The surface remains forbidden. May the ancestors preserve us, but we hear movement in the tunnels." Another voice, older and more strained. Colony Administrator Jexai recording emergency log. "Food supplies critically low. 12,000 survivors remain in the underground network, but morale is breaking down. The fear never stops. Even in the deepest bunkers, we can feel them watching us." Morrison looked at his crew. "They've been hiding underground for 8 months. Life support must be failing. Should we attempt contact?" Rodriguez asked.
"Do it."
"Let them know help has arrived." Rodriguez activated the communications array and sent a message toward the planet. "Valaxian survivors, This is the human vessel U.S. Freedom. We received the Galactic distress call and have come to assist. Please, respond. The reply came back so fast it was obvious the survivors had been listening constantly for any sign of rescue. But when the voice of Colony Administrator Jex High came through the speakers, it carried panic instead of relief. Human vessel, you must leave immediately. They will sense you. Why do you walk in the open space above our world? How can you function in their presence? Morrison activated the communication system himself. K Administrator Jex High, this is Commander Morrison. We are here to help evacuate your people. What is the nature of the threat? There was a long pause before Jex High replied, and when he did, his voice shook with terror and confusion. Commander, the Devourers are not a single species. They are a collective consciousness that spreads through psychic resonance. They feed on worlds by first paralyzing the inhabitants with overwhelming dread, then systematically harvesting everything of value. The fear they project is so intense that most civilized beings cannot think, cannot move, cannot even breathe properly. Dr. Turner moved closer to the communication station. Administrator, this is Dr. Turner, our medical officer. Can you describe the physical symptoms of this fear response? Physical symptoms? Doctor, it is not merely physical. They reach into your mind and show you every nightmare you have ever had, every death you have ever feared, every moment of helplessness you have ever experienced. They magnify these feelings until your consciousness collapses under the weight of terror. The human crew exchanged glances. Collins spoke first. That doesn't sound like anything we couldn't handle. We've all had nightmares. We've all been afraid. Do not understand, Jex High's voice came back, now sounding almost angry. This is not natural fear. This is fear so pure and intense that it strips away all rational thought. It reduces the most advanced minds to the level of frightened children. How can you speak of it so calmly? Dr. Chen stepped forward. Administrator, may I ask about your people's evolutionary background? What kind of world did the Valaxians evolve on? What does that matter? We evolved on Valaxy Prime, a world of eternal spring, where the greatest dangers came from occasional storms or territorial disputes with neighboring cities. It is a civilized world, as all proper worlds should be. Morrison looked at his crew again. The pieces were starting to fit together. Administrator, we're going to send down a shuttle to begin evacuation. Our people will escort your survivors to safety. No. Jexai's voice cracked with fear. Cannot come to the surface. They are still here. Devourers do not leave. When they finish with a world, they remain feeding on the residual terror of the survivors. If you set foot on our world, they will sense you and consume you as they have consumed so many others. Security Chief Rachel Brooks had been quietly listening to the conversation from her station. Now, she spoke up. Commander, request permission to lead the first shuttle mission to the surface. Morrison looked at her. Brooks was a veteran of 3 different colonial conflicts and had volunteered for every dangerous assignment that came up. She also happened to be from Alaska, where surviving winter required the kind of constant vigilance that made most other dangers seem manageable. Granted, take Collins and a medical team, full environmental suits and combat gear. Commander. Jex High's voice came through the speakers again. Please listen to reason. Your species should be cowering like civilized beings in the presence of such danger. But you speak of walking among our nightmares as if they were nothing more than unpleasant weather. What kind of world created minds that can function in the presence of pure terror? Dr. Turner checked his readings again. Commander, I'm still not detecting the psychological breakdown that should be affecting us. Our stress levels are elevated, but within normal combat parameters. Whatever is down there that drives other species to madness, we seem to be naturally resistant to it. Brooks was already suiting up for the shuttle mission. What could be that we're just too stupid to know when we should be scared, or too experienced? With being scared to let it stop us from doing what needs to be done, Morrison replied. The shuttle launched 20 minutes later with Brooks, Collins, and medical technician Larry Kim aboard. As they descended through the planet's atmosphere, they could see the organized cities below them more clearly. Everything had been sorted and cataloged within human precision. But among the neat rows of arranged buildings, shadows moved with purpose. Visual contact with unknown entities, Brooks reported from the pilot's seat. They look like living darkness flowing between the buildings. Recommend extreme caution. On the surface, the away team found evidence of the Devourer's systematic approach. Streets had been cleared and swept clean. Buildings had been opened and their contents sorted by material type. Organic matter in one area, metals in another. Technology in carefully arranged piles, but most disturbing were the signs that the Valaxian population had time to react. Barricades had been started but abandoned. Vehicles were found with their doors open, as if their occupants had simply stopped. In the middle of fleeing, whatever the Devourers did to their victims, it happened fast and completely. On Earth, Dr. Karen White sat in her office at the Global Defense Institute, studying the data transmission that had just arrived from the UES Freedom. The information was disturbing, but not in the way she had expected. She had been prepared for reports of human casualties or psychological breakdown. Instead, she was looking at evidence that her species might be uniquely equipped to face a threat that had paralyzed the galaxy. She called up the files on every alien species that had encountered the Devourers. Zephyrians from a world with predictable wind patterns and no dangerous weather. Archaeons from a crystal planet where the biggest threat was occasional mineral shifts. Valaxions from a garden world where conflicts were settled through discussion. Rather than violence, her assistant, Dr. Tony Martinez, brought in coffee and looked over her shoulder at the data. "What are you thinking, Karen?" "I'm thinking we might have been looking at this all wrong. Every species that the Devourers have defeated evolved on what we would consider paradise worlds. Stable climates, no natural disasters, no predators worth mentioning. They've never had to develop psychological defenses against overwhelming terror because they've never needed them." Martinez sat down across from her desk. "But humans have. Think about it. We evolved on a planet that's been trying to kill us since we first stood upright. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts, predators, diseases, and climate changes that could wipe out entire civilizations without warning. We didn't just survive all that. We got used to it." She pulled up a map of Earth showing natural disaster zones. "Look at where our major cities are located. Half of them are built on earthquake fault lines and hurricane zones or on floodplains. We know these places are dangerous, but we live there anyway because we've learned to manage constant risk." Meanwhile, in space near the Kepler system, Admiral Roy Davis was mobilizing the human fleet. The EU's Defiance, U's Resilience, and US Endurance were loading with volunteers from Earth's military forces. These weren't just regular soldiers. They were people who had been specifically chosen for their psychological profiles. Marine Sergeant Chris Powell had grown up in Tornado Alley and served 3 tours on Mars during the dust storm seasons. He had seen enough natural disasters and combat situations to know that fear was just another piece of information to process, not a reason to stop functioning. Pilot Major Kelly Thompson had survived the explosion of her first ship, spent 6 hours floating in space before rescue, and still volunteered for dangerous missions. Her psychological evaluation noted that she seemed to treat near-death experiences as learning opportunities rather than trauma. Technical Specialist Danny Foster had been born during the Great Earthquake of 2089 and raised in a family that rebuilt their home 4 times before he turned 18. His files showed that he worked better under pressure than in safe conditions back on the planet's surface. Security Chief Rachel Brooks was learning exactly what the Valaxians had been so afraid of. The dark shapes flowing between the buildings weren't just moving shadows. They were something far worse. As the entities approached, Brooks felt something trying to push into her mind. Images flashed through her consciousness. Her worst childhood nightmares, memories of friends who had died, fears about failing to protect her crew. But instead of overwhelming her, the mental assault just made her angry. "Collins, Kim, are you getting this?" she asked through her communication system. "Getting what?" Collins replied, setting up the evacuation equipment. "Some kind of pressure in my head, like a bad headache. Is that what's supposed to drive us crazy?" Kim was taking readings with his medical scanner, My equipment shows elevated stress hormones, but nothing like the complete psychological breakdown described in other encounters. Whatever these things are doing to us, it's not working the way it's supposed to. Through the underground communication system, they could hear Colony Administrator Jex High's voice, now filled with amazement as well as terror. How are you still functioning? The fear pressure should have reduced you to helpless panic by now. Every other species that has faced the Devourers directly has been incapacitated within minutes. Brooks checked her weapon as the dark entities moved closer. Maybe we're just too stubborn to know when we're beaten. The first of the Devourers reached the entrance to the underground bunkers. Up close, it looked like living shadow with many angles, as if someone had tried to create a creature out of pure nightmare. It paused when it sensed the humans, clearly confused by their lack of paralysis. Then it tried a different approach. The psychic assault intensified, flooding the humans' minds with visions of personal failure, death, and helplessness. Brooks saw herself failing to save her crew, watching them die while she stood helpless. Collins experienced every engineering disaster he had ever feared, systems failing while people counted on him to fix them. Kim felt the weight of every patient he had been unable to save, but instead of collapsing under the psychological pressure, all three humans did something the Devourers had never encountered before. They got angry. "That's it?" Brooke said, raising her weapon. "You show me my worst fears and expect me to curl up and cry? I've been living with those fears my whole life. They're what make me careful, not what make me quit." She opened fire on the nearest entity. The energy blast seemed to hurt it, causing it to recoil and emit a sound like screaming metal. The other Devourers paused, apparently communicating with each other through methods the humans couldn't detect. Collins had finished setting up the evacuation route. Bunker entrance is secure. Can start bringing up survivors. But Jex High's voice came through the communication system, filled with terror. "You cannot bring us to the surface while the Devourers are present. Fear will kill us before we reach your shuttle." Kim had an idea. "What if we don't bring you to the surface? What if we create a secure tunnel directly to our shuttle?" Working together, the three humans began establishing a safe passage from the underground bunkers to their landing site. The Devourers tried to interfere, sending wave after wave of psychic terror at them. But each attack only seemed to make the humans more focused and determined. On the UES Freedom, Commander Morrison was watching the situation develop with growing understanding. Dr. Chen had been analyzing the brain scans of the crew, comparing them to the psychological profiles of other species. "Commander, I think I know why we're resistant to the Devourer's fear attacks," she said, showing him her data. Look at the brain activity patterns. When other species encounter overwhelming fear, their higher reasoning centers shut down, become trapped in a fight-or-flight response that prevents them from thinking clearly. And humans, our brains work differently. When we encounter fear, it activates our problem-solving centers instead of shutting them down. We've evolved to think our way out of dangerous situations rather than just fleeing or freezing. Morrison nodded. Makes sense? Our ancestors didn't survive ice ages and saber-toothed tigers by panicking. They survived by staying calm and finding solutions. Dr. Turner appeared on the bridge with his latest medical readings. "Commander, there's something else? Stress hormones that the Devourer's fear attacks produce in other species seem to have a different effect on humans. Instead of causing paralysis, they're improving our reaction times and mental clarity." "More dangerous instead of less dangerous?" "Exactly. It's like they're trying to poison us with a substance that actually makes us stronger." Back on the planet's surface, the evacuation was beginning. The first group of Valaxian survivors emerged from the underground tunnels. Moving carefully through the protected passage the humans had created, they stayed as far as possible from the dark entities that lurked around the edges of the safe zone. Jex High was among the first to reach the shuttle. When he saw Brooks standing calmly between him and the Devourers, weapon ready, he could barely speak. "How?" he whispered. "Do you stand in the presence of pure terror and remain functional?" Brooks looked back at him with a slight smile. "Because terror isn't pure. It's just information. It tells you something dangerous is nearby, but it doesn't tell you to give up. It tells you to be ready." The evacuation continued for hours. Each group of survivors had to be carefully escorted through the safe passage while the humans maintained a defensive perimeter. The Devourers tried several more psychic attacks, each time seeming confused when their fear-based weapons only made the humans more alert and aggressive. Collins was the first to notice the change in the Devourers' behavior. They're pulling back. It's like they don't know what to do with us. Kim was monitoring the entities with his scanner. Energy readings are changing. They seem to be communicating with something else, something not on this planet. Morrison's voice came through their communication systems. Away team, we're detecting massive energy signatures at the edge of the system. Something big is coming. Admiral Davis's fleet arrived just as the last of the Valaxian survivors were being loaded onto the Freedom. The EU's Defiance, U's Resilience, and U.S. Endurance took positions around the system, their crews ready for whatever was approaching. The Devourer collective consciousness had existed for over 10,000 years. In all that time, it had never experienced confusion. Every species it encountered followed the same predictable pattern. First came the fear, overwhelming and absolute. Then came the paralysis, as rational thought collapsed under the weight of terror. Finally came the feeding. As the helpless populations were systematically harvested, but as the psychic assault waves crashed against the human fleet, something unprecedented happened. The collective consciousness recoiled in shock. The minds. It touched didn't collapse into terror. Instead, they became sharper, more focused, more dangerous. On the bridge of the U.S. Freedom, Commander Morrison felt the fear trying to burrow into his thoughts. Images of his worst nightmares flooded his mind. His ship exploding with his crew trapped inside. His friends dying while he watched helplessly. Every moment of doubt and failure he had ever experienced, but instead of paralyzing him, the visions only reminded him why he was here. His crew was counting on him. The galaxy was counting on him. He'd be damned if he was going to let some alien monsters use his own fears against him. All stations report ready, Lieutenant Rodriguez announced from her position at communications. Her voice was steady despite the psychic pressure beating against their minds. Chief. Engineer Collins checked his instruments. Weapons systems at full power. Engines running hot and clean. This ship is ready for a fight. Dr. Chen was monitoring the enemy fleet through her sensors. Commander, the Devourer ships are showing confusion in their movement patterns. Seem to be communicating with each other, but their formations are breaking down. Admiral Davis's voice came through the communication system from his flagship, the UES Defiance. All ships, this is Davis. The enemy appears to be disoriented by our resistance to their fear attacks. We have a tactical advantage. Let's use it. First wave of human fighters launched from the fleet carriers. Squadron leader Julia Roberts led 12 combat vessels in a direct assault on the nearest Devourer ship. As they approached, the organic vessel tried to project concentrated terror at the approaching fighters. Roberts felt the psychic attack hit her like a physical blow. Visions of her fighter exploding, of spinning helplessly through space while her air ran out, of failing her squadron and watching them die. But she had grown up in the asteroid mining colonies where equipment failure could kill you in seconds. She knew fear intimately, and she knew how to use it. Red Squadron, form up on me, she commanded, her voice calm and professional. Things want to scare us. Let's show them what scared humans can do. The fighters dove toward the Devourer ship, their weapons blazing. The organic vessel, accustomed to facing paralyzed enemies, found itself under attack by pilots who became more precise and aggressive under pressure. Its defensive systems, designed to handle the occasional, desperate last stand by dying civilizations, couldn't cope with coordinated assault by beings who fought better when afraid. On the surface of Kepler 44-B, Marine Sergeant Chris Powell was leading a boarding party through the wreckage of a crashed Devourer scout ship. The entity inside was still alive, still projecting waves of psychic terror at anyone who came near. Powell's squad moved through the organic corridors like they were walking through a particularly unpleasant neighborhood back on Earth. The fear was there, constant and pressing, but it just made them more careful and alert. Contact ahead, reported Corporal Lisa Wong. Her weapon trained on a massive living shadow that writhed between the ship's organic walls. The thing is trying to get into my head, But all I'm getting is images of basic training. Not exactly nightmare material. Powell nodded. That's because you survived basic training. These things don't understand that we use fear as a training tool. They think showing us difficult situations will break us down. Technical specialist Danny Foster was examining the ship's organic technology, while the creature tried to drive him insane with visions of engineering disasters. But Foster had actually lived through most of the failures the entity was showing him. Instead of being terrified, he was taking notes. "Sergeant, this is fascinating," Foster said, completely ignoring the psychic assault. "Their technology is based on biological processes, but it's designed for beings that think as a collective, no individual initiative systems at all." The Devourer entity tried harder, flooding Foster's mind with images of every possible way his equipment could fail. But Foster just smiled and continued his analysis. "Thanks for the safety demonstration," he told the creature. "This gives me some great ideas for improvements to our own systems." Back in space, the battle was turning into something the Devourers had never experienced before. Their ships moved with perfect coordination, following patterns refined over millennia of consuming helpless civilizations, but the human forces operated with chaotic adaptability that the collective consciousness couldn't predict. Lieutenant Colonel Ben Carter broke formation to exploit a tactical opening that appeared when two Devourer ships tried to coordinate their psychic attacks. His fighter squadron hit them from an unexpected angle while they were focused on projecting terror. Captain Sarah Mitchell led a destroyer escort through what should have been a suicide run between three enemy vessels. But instead of being paralyzed by the concentrated fear assault, her crew used the adrenaline rush to coordinate their weapons fire with inhuman precision. Engineer Danny Foster, now back aboard the Freedom after examining the crashed scout ship, was working on something that made Commander Morrison very nervous. "You want to do what?" Morrison asked, looking at Foster's proposal. "Reprogram their own technology to work for us," Foster explained. "Their ships are controlled by the collective consciousness, but the biological systems can be convinced too. Accept different commands, if you know how to ask nicely." "You learn this how?" "The creature on the scout ship kept showing me visions of their technology failing. After about an hour of watching their systems break down in my head, I figured out how they work. It's actually pretty simple once you realize they're not designed for independent thinking." Dr. Chen looked up from her analysis of the enemy fleet. "Commander Foster might be on to something. The Devourer ships show no signs of individual decision-making capability. They're all controlled by the collective consciousness. If we could disrupt that connection, the individual ships would be helpless," Morrison finished.
Do it?
"The plan required the Freedom to get close enough to the largest Devourer vessel to upload Foster's virus into their biological systems. It would mean flying directly into the heart of the enemy fleet, surrounded by creatures that had been trying to drive them insane for hours. All hands. This is the commander," Morrison announced over the ship's communication system. "We're going to ram the biggest ship out there, but instead of blowing up, we're going to board it and teach these things what happens when you try to scare a human." The response from his crew was immediate and enthusiastic. They had been fighting off psychic terror attacks for hours, and instead of wearing them down, the constant pressure had only made them more determined. Security Chief Rachel Brooks assembled her boarding party in the shuttle bay. Marines, engineers, and medical personnel, all of whom had been listening to the Devourers whisper their worst fears at them for the better part of a day. "Listen up," Brooks told her team. "These things think they can control us by showing us scary pictures. But we're from a planet where scary pictures are what we call Tuesday. Let's go show them what real predators look like." The Freedom accelerated toward the command ship of the Devourer fleet. As they approached, the psychic assault intensified to levels that should have reduced any crew to gibbering madness. Visions of death, failure, and cosmic horror flooded their minds. But the human crew just got angrier. Collins rerouted power from non-essential systems to give them more speed. Rodriguez coordinated with the other human ships to provide covering fire. Dr. Turner prepared medical supplies for casualties that everyone knew were coming. The Freedom hit the Devourer command ship like a missile, punching through its organic hull and lodging deep in its biological structure. Instead of the explosion the Devourers expected, they found themselves dealing with boarding parties that seemed to treat penetrating their nightmarish vessel as just another day at work. Brooks led her team through corridors that pulsed with living tissue and dripped with substances that shouldn't exist. The ship itself tried to drive them mad, projecting concentrated terror that would have killed most species through pure psychological shock. "Foster, how's that virus coming?" Brooks asked, shooting at something that looked like it was made of crystallized fear. "Almost there," Foster replied, connecting his equipment to what appeared to be the ship's central nervous system. "Just need to convince this thing that individual thinking is a good idea?" The collective consciousness suddenly realized what the humans were trying to do. For the first time in its existence, it felt something like panic. These creatures weren't just resistant to fear. They were using its own weapons against it. The psychic assault reached levels that should have been impossible for any biological mind to survive. The silence was the first thing that everyone noticed. For hours, the psychic screaming of the Devourers had been a constant pressure in the minds of every human in the system. Now, suddenly it was gone. In its place came something far more disturbing to the collective consciousness than any fear they had ever projected individual thoughts. Throughout the Devourer fleet, entities that had existed as part of a unified mind for thousands of years suddenly found themselves alone. Each ship, each creature, each node of what had been a seamless network was now forced to think for itself. And for beings that had never experienced solitude, the isolation was more terrifying than any nightmare they had ever inflicted on others. On the command ship, Security Chief Rachel Brooks watched in fascination as the organic walls around them began to pulse erratically. The living corridors that had been trying to drive her team insane with fear were now writhing in confusion. "Foster, what exactly did your virus do to them?" she asked, stepping over what looked like a nervous system having a breakdown. Technical specialist Danny Foster was monitoring his equipment, watching data streams that showed the dissolution of a consciousness that had spanned galaxies. "I introduced the concept of individual mortality to every node in their network. Each part of their collective mind is now aware that it exists separately and that it can die alone. And that scares them more than anything they've ever shown us. Apparently, they've been existing as an immortal collective for so long that the idea of personal death is completely alien to them. It's like we just taught a hive mind what loneliness feels like." Throughout the Devourer fleet, ships began to behave erratically. Some fled toward the edge of the system, their crews panicking at the realization that they might die without the comfort of the collective consciousness. Others simply shut down, overwhelmed by the weight of individual existence. A few tried to re-establish contact with their network. Foster's virus had made sure that any attempt to reconnect would only spread the concept of individual mortality further. On the UES Freedom, Commander Morrison watched the enemy fleet disintegrate. With a mixture of satisfaction and pity, Dr. Chen was analyzing the readings from the collapsing collective consciousness. "Commander, they're broadcasting emotional states I've never seen before," she reported. "Fear, but not the kind they project at others. This is existential terror. They're experiencing the fear of being truly alone for the first time in their existence. Are they still dangerous? Some of them, yes. They're no longer coordinated. Each ship is acting independently, and most of them don't seem to know how to function without the collective telling them what to do." Admiral Davis's voice came through the communication system. "All ships, this is Davis. The enemy fleet is in full retreat. We have casualties, but minimal. Recommend pursuit and capture of disabled vessels for intelligence gathering." Morrison looked at his crew. They had been fighting for hours, facing psychological warfare that would have destroyed most civilizations. But instead of being broken by the experience, they seemed energized by their victory. Admiral, Morrison replied. "Let them go. They're more afraid of us now than we ever were of them." 3 days later, the UES Freedom docked at New Harmony Station. The same council chamber that had been filled with terrified alien representatives now buzzed with activity. But the mood was completely different. Ambassador Veltar of the Zephyrians stood as Morrison entered the room, his wing-like appendages, which had been folded in fear just days earlier, now spread wide in a gesture of respect. Commander Morrison, Veltar said, his voice carrying amazement rather than terror. The galactic community owes you and your species a debt that can never be repaid. The Devourer threat has been eliminated. How can we ever thank you? Morrison looked around the chamber at representatives from 12 different species. Them were staring at him and his crew with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Can start by understanding why it worked, Morrison replied. We didn't defeat the Devourers because we're braver than you. We defeated them because we come from a world that taught us to use fear as a tool instead of a weapon against ourselves. The crystalline being Quartzinger made harmonious vibrations that translated as curiosity. Commander, your species continues to confound us. You walk through situations that would paralyze our greatest warriors, and you speak of fear as if it were a useful resource. Dr. Chen stepped forward, carrying her analysis of the battle. That's because it is a useful resource. Fear tells you when something is dangerous, prepares your body for action, sharpens your mind for problem solving. But only if you've learned to work with it instead of being controlled by it. Hi, Admiral Zexanon. Look thoughtful. Are you suggesting that other species could learn these techniques? Or suggesting that other species need to learn these? Techniques? Morrison replied. The galaxy is a dangerous place. There will be other threats, other predators. You can't face them by hiding or running away every time. The next several months saw changes throughout the galaxy that nobody had expected. The human victory over the Devourers hadn't just eliminated a threat, it had revealed a fundamental weakness in how most civilized species approached danger. Dr. Karen White found herself leading the first Interspecies Psychological Resilience Institute on New Harmony Station. Alien species that had never experienced real danger began sending their best minds to learn from a species they had previously considered primitive. The Valaxian survivors, led by Colony Administrator Jex High, established the first mixed species colony on a world that humans considered only mildly challenging. Under human guidance, they learned to live with variable weather, minor seismic activity, and the psychological pressure of never being completely safe. Told Morrison during one of his visits to the colony. We who prided ourselves on our advanced civilization have learned more about courage from your primitive species than from thousands of years of our own development. Courage isn't about not being afraid, Morrison replied, watching a group of young Valaxians practice emergency procedures with human instructors. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. The training programs that developed from human knowledge spread throughout the galaxy. Species that had lived in safety for millennia began deliberately exposing themselves to controlled dangers. Not to become warriors, but to develop the psychological tools they would need to face an uncertain universe. The Archaean Collective began building their crystal cities in areas with minor geological instability. The Zephyrians started practicing flying in unpredictable weather patterns. Even the mighty Dorvek, who had thought themselves the galaxy's greatest warriors, began learning from human combat veterans about fighting while afraid. But the most significant change came in how the galaxy viewed fear itself. What had once been seen as a weakness, something to be eliminated or hidden from, became recognized as a natural and useful response to danger. 6 months after the battle at Kepler 442, New Harmony Station hosted the dedication ceremony for the Memorial to the Lost Worlds. Representatives from every species in the galactic community gathered to honor the billions who had been lost to the Devours. The memorial was a simple crystal flame that burned at the center of a circular chamber. To light it, someone would have to walk alone across a space that every alien instinct said was dangerous. The chamber was designed to trigger mild fear responses in most species, a reminder of what they had learned about facing their anxieties. Morrison stood at the edge of the chamber with thousands of alien representatives watching from behind protective barriers. Their instincts told them the space was unsafe. Walking across it alone was foolish and dangerous. But Morrison had learned long ago that sometimes the most important things required taking that first step into uncertainty. He walked across the chamber floor, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The assembled aliens watched as he lit the memorial flame, then turned to address them. "Fear's not your enemy," he said. his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. Fear is what keeps you alive long enough to be brave. The beings we remember today were lost not because they were afraid, but because they let fear stop them from acting when action was needed. He paused, looking out at the thousands of representatives from species that were still learning to live with uncertainty. The galaxy is vast and dangerous and full of unknowns. You can spend your lives hiding from that truth, or you can learn to walk forward into it. The choice is yours. For a long moment, absolute silence filled the chamber. Then Admiral Xenon stepped forward from the protective area. His people had been galactic leaders for thousands of years, but he had never walked alone into something that frightened him. He took one step forward, then another. Behind him, Ambassador Veltar followed, his wings trembling but his resolve firm. Court Singer began moving across the floor, his crystalline form resonating with new harmonies. One by one, the representatives of 12 different species walked forward into the space that their instincts told them was dangerous. They moved slowly, carefully, but they moved. Morrison smiled as he watched them. The galaxy had learned an important lesson. Fear wasn't something to be conquered or eliminated.